Len Popyak, he needs no introduction. He's a big man in this field. Sorry, a bad joke, but in terms of hard problems, if I'm going to talk about quantitative versus qualitative metrics, I think that the qualitative metrics approach has to take account of what constitutes a hard problem, such that if I need to manage resources, I can put them at where my most difficulty lies. And so, without further ado, to Len Popyak, old friend of mine and now at Utica College.
Thanks, Paul. So I want to talk about a couple workshops we had over this past year. And at that time, I was the interim director for the Cyber Research Institute. So I was afforded the opportunity to run these workshops. And once I went through what data we have, turned out to be quite illuminating. So what I want to do here is just give you an overview, a summary of some of the findings of those two workshops. So back in March of this year, coincident with spring break, so we could get some academics here, during March, we had our first cybersecurity workshop. And we had about 50 invited people, and we split them up into 4 groups and looking at identifying the challenges, the hard problems, and some of the research challenges that would be out there. So all these briefings and papers are available on the Cyber Research Institute webpage. Simply sign in there, and there's a couple tabs for Workshop 1 and Workshop 2. Then what we thought was, in the summertime, we thought we would bring in more industrial people and mix them up with the academics and see if we had some new areas that we could focus on. So we actually dedicated a focus areas on financial community, defense, medical devices, which turned out to be extremely interesting. We'll get into it. Healthcare information systems, industrial control and SCADA, and a few more. So what we did was we invited in some subject area experts, allowed them to show us what some of their hard problems are, and get the group thinking about what common hard problems in cybersecurity are. So in that summer session, we had about 101 actual attendees, and we split them up again into 4 focus groups. So the instructions for the first workshop, we tried to constrain the hard problems of those that could be solved in 2 to 3 years. So those were the instructions. It didn't quite turn out that way. There are some hard problems that I think will extend out for many years, including what we're looking at here today is metrics. I don't think we're going to solve that issue in 2 or 3 years. But the method we had was we brainstormed a lot of cross-cutting ideas, we categorized them into themes, and then identified the domains that would be most impacted. So some of the domains that we were looking at were, of course, defense and military, government, intelligence, financial, the healthcare sector, transportation, power, and others. And some of the things that the participants had to consider are some of the factors that are out there today, such as the enormous amount of malware that's constantly coming out, different cyber attacks, botnets, SCADA systems and industrial control systems, bring your own devices, data breaches that are pretty prevalent today, and we're seeing more of them. And then anonymity and unmanaged systems. All of those things come into play here when we start thinking about what are the real hard problems. And this is just a small palette of what's out there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some of the results of some of our groups. Now the groups were about 6 to 8 people in size and pretty focused. So as I run through here, you're going to see some common attributes that almost everybody found in their group. So I'm not putting these in any sort of order, so I'm just presenting them to you basically raw. And the first group found that they were concerned about cyber physical systems, that are becoming more prevalent today. They thought about smart grid. How is smart grid going to affect some of the hard problems in that area? Cyber education, one of the big problems out there. Authentication, and keep note of this one is because this shows up a lot. What are the different authentication schemes out there, and what are the hard problems associated with that? Another one they came up with is unappreciated modes. And they categorized this as things like acoustic communication that are out of band, things like electric power meters that can measure what you're doing in your home and then relay that information. It's basically privacy information. And then I got thinking, well, just recently they came out with a Samsung TV that watches the watchers. And you have to be careful of that. Something that's very interesting is resiliency and restoration. There's a lot of issues with that. Data at rest and in motion. And then medical concerns. At that time, this was back in March, we could simply identify some of the concerns and then just bin them into a category called medical. And then, of course, defense against 0 days. Group 2 looked at ways of assessing trust and ways to minimize trust in service providers, especially when you don't own those service providers. You're only renting bandwidth or you're renting part of their router. You don't really control that. Security under constraints, for example, bandwidth, computation, storage, latency, all those factors. Information ownership and privacy, we touched on that. And then hardware root of trust. Can you actually get a root of trust from somewhere in hardware? Ultimately, from perhaps all the way from the chip manufacturer. And then software and hardware and humans, how humans may be the weakest link. Can there be ways to minimize that? And then technology, less of a barrier than economics. Gets back to some of the previous talks where everyone wanted to know how much would it cost. And then perhaps we could identify incentives in some way that could be used as metrics. Group 3 looked at trusted systems. They looked at privacy, what the human element is. Again, we're seeing some of the very common characteristics that flow through the groups. Quantifying the value of security. Is there a way of quantifying that in some manner? Whether it be cost or how long a red team takes to break in, some quantity of or quantifying element. Detection and deterrence. Have we reached the limit of signature detectors? And my thoughts are yes, we are reaching that limit. So what we're finding is the antivirus companies are actually looking at new and interesting ways of analyzing malicious code these days. Automation, how much automation can we incorporate? Insider threat, very common hard problem. And then characterizing what we mean by security goodness. And of course the science of cybersecurity. Modeling and simulation, how could we model and simulate some of the activity that is out there? How would you model a 0-day exploit? And ensuring security in remote, proprietary, or unfriendly situations. You may not know what's inside of a black box or your electric power meter that the company puts on the outside of your house. But how would you minimize the loss of privacy versus them monitoring what you're doing? Addressing the vulnerability of trust. This is group 4. And then identification of system behavior. This is actually, this turned out to be quite a large body of work that Binghamton University was heavily involved in. Instead of looking at signatures of malicious activity, perhaps we can look better at behavior of activity. And then of course the cyber and physical system comes up again. Assuring reliable cloud services. If you don't own it and it's in the cloud, how can you assure that it is secure? And vulnerability of system maintenance procedures. This is one that you wouldn't think of right off the bat, but if you get involved in military operations or even maintenance operations of equipment. This is an area that adversaries are looking at, including like ATM machines. There have been reports of folks just cutting holes in ATM machines, slipping a flash drive into it and emptying it out of all of its money, and then coming back for more. Complexity of hardware and security problems due to increased complexity and density of the devices. That's not going to stop, so there are hard problems associated with how much we're putting on devices these days. So that was the results of the first workshop, and in the second workshop we invited some subject area experts in, and I'm not sure how well that shows up, but we had a number of folks come in, and some of these talks were very exciting and very interesting. Cyber warfare, some of the activity that was happening currently over the summer within Russia and Georgia and the Ukraine. So we had a briefing on that. We had several briefings from folks down at the lab, and those were very well received. And then we had some briefings on SCADA. We actually had a panel of folks that came in and talked to us about SCADA and some of those problems. Dr. Peter Bloniars came in and talked about what New York State was doing in cybersecurity from his perspective at the governor's office. We had the financial sector highlight some of their hard problems. The Power Authority, Ms. Lena Smart, came in and highlighted some of their activity. We looked at the Heartbleed malware that was out there this summer. We looked at certified security, how we apply formal methods and more mathematical, rigorous methods to assuring validity in what the code is doing. And we had a very exciting talk about medical devices that kind of rolled into what some of the participants were thinking of in some of their output of the second workshop. Matter of fact, it was very exciting when we started talking about the vulnerabilities of embedded systems, and in particular, some of the medical devices that we take for granted today. We also talked about biometrics, adaptive malware, spear phishing attacks, and then we got into a long discussion about healthcare records. And given the fact that the fines are very hefty these days for releasing medical information, it's on everybody's radar as one of the hard problems in that industry. And then we talked about some of the harder problems in computer forensics. The fact that many drives these days come pre-encrypted, or they have encryption hardware built in. A lot of phones are turning on encryption in a way that you can't take a data dump of them and then go back and look for the suspect's data. So again, we split people into groups, and then we gave them marching orders of, okay, what are some of the hard problems, given the fact that you've just seen a number of experts from industry tell us what they're seeing in the real world. So, so some of the group one actually had Dr. Sorry, I don't remember his name. Dr. Baker. He was actually here from Welch Allen out on the West Coast, and there's also a Welch Allen here in New York State. And those folks really came through and highlighted some of the medical device vulnerabilities. And he really guided Group 1 in looking at some of the hard problems that they were facing. So the emergent field of medical device sensors, and there's many of them out there right now. They talked about wireless data transfers that offer the freedom of patient movement. And they had a lot of information security challenges. For example, how do you authenticate data between the practitioner and the device? And then the patient and the device. And then how do you secure that data on the device itself? And then how do you secure the data in transit? And then how do you protect that information as it's being moved through the medical system? So those are all very hard problems for that field, that are common hard problems for many of the other fields as well. And then some of their challenge problems were, can we find a foundational method that can be developed for trust associations, maintaining that chain of attribution, whether it's a bit or some data field that can maintain that chain of attribution. And I've seen that in other areas, for example, the intelligence field, where the chain of attribution is very important. And then how to temporarily use personally identifiable information, so that other groups actually identified this later on as data evaporation. Group 2 looked at the lack of formal proofs, local formalization, and mathematically robust verification for identification, verification, measurement in a number of aspects. So they were looking more at the mathematical concepts of how to secure data. So you're looking at identification of the domain definition of security. They looked at relevant security threat models, realistic versus cost-benefit analysis, and then the levels of acceptable trust and resultant secured state, when you say something's secure. And then the efficacy of the analysis tools. Is what the tools are giving us, is it useful? Is it effective? Group 2 looked at the Internet of Things and the vulnerability of fixed, centrally controlled physical systems. So they looked at how to effectively implement those technologies and secure their components and interactions, and then what some of the socio-political effects are. They also looked at attack as being preemptive. Can we attack back? Or when we know we're going to be attacked, can we do things proactively? And then they looked at also movement, mobility, and setting up traps as preemption. Group 3 went back and they were looking at authentication and authorization of users and devices. So this group was primarily formed with a lot of the healthcare guys that were at the conference. So they were mostly concerned with authentication of users, devices, and keeping that data secure. Then they also looked at the assurance of embedded systems and cyber-physical systems and the Internet of Things that are really coming up on us. They also looked at cyber immune systems that could be used to protect software and hardware beyond what we currently have with signature detectors today. And then they looked at various dimensions of cost and benefit of cybersecurity. So that's another element that we see in common through some of these groups. Finally, Group 4 looked at some of the metrics, metric-driven security as a very big challenge. We have a lack of tried and true model and processes that support decision-making and resource allocation. They looked at the fact that you can use the number of employees in an IT department. Maybe that's some way of measuring how effective you are. And they looked at metrics-driven security programs that incorporates risk management. And then, of course, they looked at cost and benefit ratios. Finally, they looked at trusted embedded systems, perhaps even moving part of the operating system into hardware or into silicon instead of having it out there preloaded or loaded from a hardware device like a hard drive or flash drive. Group 4 also looked at transaction-based identity management, looking at those things, for example, layered profiles, data evaporation. Do you actually need the data to be present all the time? Can you get rid of the data at some point in the transaction? And then automated data classification. They also looked at identity management technologies, and the goal there was to strike a balance between the requirements for strong identity management and privacy considerations. So that's a big problem in the healthcare records management area. They also looked at virtualization environments where they might be able to move entire execution platforms between one execution environment and another, and keeping the execution environment running rather than some piece of hardware. Basically forms of resiliency. They also looked at anonymization techniques. In particular, when you're looking at healthcare records or things that are personally identifiable, can you implement some anonymous techniques that could keep some of that data at least private, some portions private. So we had a rich collection of output from the 2 workshops. There are a couple papers that highlight all of this information in detail on the Cyber Research Institute webpage. You can simply sign on, download those papers, and I believe there's also a paper upcoming in one of your publications coming up. But we did have a rich collection of activity here over the past year, and please make use of that data as much as you can. Any questions? Okay. Yeah.
Do you have a future conferences planned or workshops planned?
I'll refer to the current executive director and see if it's an ongoing activity.
We're planning on another one in July of next year.
They were actually quite useful for everyone that attended, and I thought they were very interesting, especially when we brought in the subject area experts. They really guided and added flow to the workshops. More questions?
Len, I've got a quick question for you, and that's formal methods and metrics. Have you any ideas in that area that came out of your metrics discussions?
So there were a number of ideas, and I would refer you to Shukai Chin over at SU, and he would be able to talk formal methods far better than I could. But it is truly an area that has been around for a number of years, and it has really come into its own in a maturity level in that we know that we need it. That's a 0 day.
Maybe. There we go. All right. So I agree with you. Shukai has done some wonderful work in that area, and I am, in fact, hoping that we can apply some of these formal methods to metrics justification and validation as well. Okay. Thank you very much. Are there any further questions? Okay.